Chapter 15 of The Miserable Life of Bernie LeBaron, A Tomb in the Woods.
I was in the military for a long time,
Jed told me as he re-raked the yard.
I drove dune buggies in the first Gulf War.
I didn't know they used dune buggies in the army, I said. I leaned on my rake and looked over at him. He stopped too and wiped his sleeve across his brow.
They had to there, he said. The sand was terrible. Regular jeeps got all bogged down in it. The fighting was fierce at first, but then it turned into a slaughter. The war only lasted about 100 hours.
Really?
That's it. We went in ahead of the tanks. We had orders not to stop because the tanks couldn't see us in the dark. 20 minutes in, our dune buggy stalled. We only had a few seconds before the tank ran over us.
He paused and stared off into the trees.
3 of my buddies were killed. I was in the hospital for 6 months.
I didn't know what to say. It seemed like some pretty personal stuff to tell a kid. But I listened anyway. When Jed glanced over at me and saw me leaning on my rake, he kicked a bunch of leaves at me and waited until I started raking again. Then he continued.
Later, they sent me to Afghanistan, where a roadside bomb ripped my leg open and killed 2 more of my buddies. They discharged me after that.
I saw Jed's gaze drift to the mailbox piled high with junk. I couldn't see anything new there, and I wondered what it had to do with his time in the military. Was it like Vietnam? I asked.
Jed shook his head. Then he stopped and thought for a minute. I guess it was, kind of. We didn't always know who the enemy was, and a lot of innocent people got killed. So I guess it was.
Needless to say, despite my fears, Jed went up several notches in my estimation. I mean, he had been a real soldier and had seen real combat. It's not that I wanted to go to war or anything, but knowing someone who has is just cool. And to hear that Jed had lost people he loved somehow left me feeling less alone in the world. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. And I needed that feeling because a few days later, I got a letter from Missy. I tore it open as I rushed for my room. She started off by saying that everything was about the same, by which I know she meant that Dad was still abusing her emotionally. Then she said that Dad was dating someone. That line stopped me dead in my tracks. I read it again, and then again. Dad was dating someone? Who would want to date a man that abandoned his children and abused his wife? The creep. The complete meathead. And Missy had to sit there and watch him wine and dine this woman after the way he had treated our mom? I could imagine the kind of stuff he said, too, because I had heard it all my life. He had constantly complained that my mom didn't keep the house clean enough or cook well enough, and he even told her once that he didn't like the way she dressed. He was the idiot who bought her the clothes she had to wear. I wished again that I could get Missy away from him. In the letter, Missy told me all about how Emily had died. I had to blink back the sting in my eyes and swallow the bullfrog that climbed up my throat, especially when she described how Emily looked in the casket, all pale and tiny, like a porcelain doll. Part of me wished I could have been there to say goodbye. The other part was glad I had missed it. This way I could remember Emily the way she was when she was alive, cute and cuddly with big dimpled smiles and rosy cheeks. That was the Emily I was going to cling to, not some frail, breakable doll who had been cheated out of the happiness and the years she should have experienced in the arms of the mother who had loved her. Now both my mom and my sister had been broken by a pitiless world, and I was left to struggle against the ever-present memory of what should have been. The dream started about a week after I found out that Emily had died. Little Emily would come and reach out for me the way she used to when she wanted me to pick her up. She would say, "I love you, Bern," and I would wake up crying. I guess my wimpy streak was coming out again. I couldn't help it. By the time September faded into October and the trees stretched their naked branches in preparation for their long winter sleep, I had made a few friends. Tatiana wasn't speaking to me. Even in science lab, she wrote notes down and handed them to me rather than speak. But that was my fault. I had lost my little sister, been scared out of the woods, and I offended one of the few friends I had. Not much was going right for me. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I wasn't going to sit around and just take it. I couldn't do anything about Emily, but I wasn't going to stay out of the woods forever. I couldn't. I needed the woods the way I needed air to breathe. And I was going to catch that big galoot who murdered people and buried them in my woods. I came up with a new plan that I began to put into action the second week of October. I got up early that Saturday just before the sun was up and pedaled past Jed's weird mailbox, across the bog and into the forest beyond. I had dressed in my camouflage clothes like I sometimes did when I was trying to see the animals rather than just take pictures of them. I ditched my bike in the bushes and sidled up the trail, moving very slowly. I saw a raccoon in a tree, which was unusual, and I think I saw a mink bounding off through the pines, which was just cool. The newly fallen leaves were damp with the rain that had drizzled through the night, so I could move through the woods with very little sound. Some vapor still lingered in the trees, casting everything in a weird, ghostly light. The air smelled like it had just been scrubbed clean. I loved the smell of the woods on a fall morning. I hadn't realized how much I missed being out there alone. I went deeper into the woods than I had ever gone, following the direction I knew the big man with the broad-brimmed hat had been walking. I moved really slow because I didn't want to accidentally bump into him. The trail narrowed where the animals crossed some marshy ground to get to the higher ground on the other side. As I searched for a path across, I found a print in the soft earth. After my eyes found the first print, I began to find prints all over the place. These were fresh, not more than a day old. Someone had made it a regular practice of coming through here. I could see plain as day the big crack on the right shoe, the same as the plaster cast I had sitting on my dresser at home. It dawned on me then that only someone who couldn't afford new boots would wear a boot with such a big crack in the sole. A crack that size would let in all the water. My murderer was not only big and bloodthirsty, but he was also poor. Jed didn't seem poor to me, but I couldn't think of anyone else that was big enough to be the man in my photos. That thought kept my mind working as I backed into a big patch of ferns that were just turning brown and tried to become a part of them. The forest became spooky all of a sudden, and I was glad I had my camouflage on. I'd watched far too many Hitchcock movies. I surveyed the area and waited until I was sure no one was around. I picked a good climbing tree with a thick branch about 15 feet off the ground and scrambled up. I shimmied out on the branch and positioned my camera so that it looked down on the trail. I put a cable and padlock on it just in case the guy found it. Then I went back to the tracks. I decided not to cross there because I didn't want whoever came through to see my tracks. I worked my way through the nasty briars until I could get around the marshy area and then slogged back to where the tracks came out on the higher ground. The trail they made was wide and clear. The huckleberry bushes and grasses had all been trampled flat. Every time I found a good tree, I scrambled up and placed one of my cameras on a branch. I saved one for the end of the trail, just in case. This went on for a while until I stumbled into a little open glade in the wood. I stopped and stared. A creek gurgled to one side. The forest canopy was open, letting the early morning light slant through the trees to sparkle on the droplets of rain that still clung to everything. The leaves on the trees were bursting with every shade of yellow and red. The grass in the middle was knee-high and waved in the breeze as if beckoning to me. The birds were setting up a racket all around, so that the glade felt like a primeval playground of nature. I stood there for a long time, just soaking it in, breathing in the life of the forest. A path through the grass had been trampled down where the big man passed. In the center of the glade sat a long pile of rocks. Flowers had been planted beside it, but they were shriveled and brown, drooping as if they bowed to the silent, sorrowful grave. A chill ran through me. I resisted the temptation to stride right up to the rocks because I didn't want to leave any sign. That pile of stones fascinated me like nothing else. Who was buried under it? Why had they been killed? What was the big man trying to hide? And if he was trying to hide something, why would he build a pile of rocks that told everyone he had been here and what he had done? Maybe the pile was a diversion, and the real body was concealed someplace else. I hid my camera under a drooping branch hanging low on a young pine tree. I placed it so that some tall grass in front would make it hard to see. I knew this would mess up my photos, but it would reduce the chance that someone might see it on accident. Then I worked my way back out to the bog, taking a different path so I wouldn't leave any sign. I was so preoccupied with the pile of stones and what my cameras might find that I didn't see them until they were almost on top of me.